of, my goodness, meteoritic iron. You know, this is certainly a physical element, and for sure, sometimes UFOs, as well as being visual, show up on radar screens. There are radar traces, so there is undoubtedly a physical element to this. But I think we shouldn't leap to the conclusion, because that is so, that therefore it means we are dealing with beings basically like us, who've just traveled a very long way to get here. Maybe the long way they've traveled has actually been across the boundaries between dimensions, and maybe they've created physical devices to enable them not only to project their consciousness from one dimension to another, but to project themselves physically in some way. I think I'm totally open to that, and I think that is definitely going on, and that's why you brought it up earlier, and I kind of led us on a bit of a diversion, but this issue of aliens, fairies, and spirits, which I explore at length in Supernatural, is a very, very important issue, I think, to understanding this phenomenon. Right now, today, in the Amazon, in Central Africa, and in other parts of the world where you have hunter-gatherer societies still existing, they have shamans, and those shamans, the universal characteristic of shamanism around the world is the targeted, deliberate use of altered states of consciousness. And there are many ways to put ourselves into altered states of consciousness. It can be rhythmic dance, as in the case of the Bushmen of the Kalahari. They do a trance dance, as they call it, around a fire for up to 24 hours without stopping.
That would put you in a trance.
Absolutely. And they experience their spirits leaving their bodies and entering another realm where they encounter what they construe as spirits, which teach them vital knowledge. Those spirits have certain very definite characteristics when they're described. Now let's jump to another phenomenon, the phenomenon that was common in Europe roughly from 1,000 years ago until it began to peter out in the 1940s and 50s, and this was the phenomenon of encounters with beings that Europeans used to call fairies or elves. Very often you would see the fairies dancing in a circle. If you were to go to that circle and put your hand to touch the movement, you would be drawn into it. And you would then be carried away into another world, where you would encounter the beings who you construed as fairies and elves. And again, they had very definite, specific characteristics that were described. And quite often you would feel that you'd been with them for an hour or two, and they would then return you to your world. And you would discover that vast time had passed. In some cases, 300 years had passed. There are stories of people who entered a fairy circle and came out 300 years later thinking that it was the same afternoon, and discovered that their disappearance was a subject of legend in the village that they had come from. Bit familiar, isn't it, with the missing time phenomenon with alien abductions today, except the so-called aliens appear to be more merciful. That they don't give us 300 years of missing time; they give us 3 or 4 hours of missing time, so that we can reconnect to our world. In short, I'm suggesting that the fairy dance and the flying saucer are both technologies. Perhaps in the other dimensions, the technology evolves as well, but they're both doing the same thing. They're abducting us into another realm, another state of reality. And so finally, we do come to the modern form of this phenomenon. I believe they're all the same phenomenon, seen through different cultural spectacles. The modern form is what we call alien abductions. And again, very specific characteristics are ascribed to the aliens by the people who construe them as such and who have these experiences. And let's just examine these common characteristics, and I do this at length in Supernatural, which unite these three supposedly different realms of fairies, spirits, and aliens. Very often, the alien abductee will appear, abductor will appear to the abductee first in the form of an animal. John Mack's work at the University of Harvard, which I know you're deeply familiar with, documents thousands of abduction encounters. And in vast numbers of them, and John draws attention to this himself, the late, wonderful John Max, so I'm so sorry that he's not with us anymore. Tragic loss of a great human being. What he documents is that very often the alien who later transforms into a typical gray first appears in the form of an animal, or like a wolf or a deer or a bird, typically an owl. Owls are very often seen. Or in the form of a therianthrope. Now, that's a Greek word. It comes from therion, which means wild beast, and anthropos, which means man. In other words, a hybrid who is part human and part animal in form, and then later may transform into the form of the gray with the broad forehead and narrow-pointed chin and large dark eyes. But very often the being is first encountered as an animal or as a therianthrope. This is identical with fairies. If you go back to the Middle Ages and look at the accounts of fairy abductions, they very often first encounter the fairy in an animal or in a therianthrope, a beast man form. And then he later transforms into, the fairy form, which is, again, this high, broad forehead, narrow-pointed chin, large, dark eyes that we call grays today. Right. And lo and behold, it's the same with the spirits that shamans are encountering in the jungles of Brazil today, that they appear in animal or therianthropic form and later transform into the form that we would recognize as grays. And what I'm suggesting is that in all these different experiences, it's actually the same experience that is being had, and it's being construed through different cultural frameworks. We, as beings, it's impossible for us to see or experience anything without interpreting it at the same time. Interpretation is built into human perception from the get-go, and inevitably we will interpret what we experience within the framework of our culture and our society. Our culture and our society today is in the business of exploring outer space, so we construe these experiences as visitors from outer space, that otherwise just like us. In the past, it was fairies, and in hunter-gatherer societies, it's spirits. That's how they construe them, but I'm suggesting that the underlying reality, and there is a reality that underlies this, is one and the same.
Yeah, some even said they came from the sea.
And some say they come from the sea, yes, absolutely. And in fact, there are UFO abductees who report being taken down under the sea into great caverns beneath the sea, a very familiar experience to shamans in the Amazon. For example, shamans often believe that they are abducted down beneath the waters of the Amazon River, where they come to an extraordinary city of crystal towers and gigantic ziggurats that is called Encante, the enchanted city that lies beneath the waters of the Amazon. All these experiences are made possible by altered states of consciousness. But I don't believe they are artifacts of altered states of consciousness. I believe they're real experiences that can only be accessed in an altered state of consciousness. And this is why Rick Strassman's work, which I mentioned earlier, at the University of New Mexico, is so important, because his, and he has published this in a book called DMT, The Spirit Molecule. He was the first scientist for more than 20 years to be given permission by the federal government to work with human volunteers on a Schedule I substance, in this case dimethyltryptamine, DMT, which, as I also mentioned earlier, is produced in the human brain. And Rick was adding to the amount of DMT in his volunteers' bodies by giving them DMT on a hospital bed at the University of New Mexico. And in the 20-minute DMT trip that is typical with DMT, his volunteers reported extraordinary experiences. The volunteers were not comparing notes, but many of them reported meeting the same beings.
Isn't that incredible?
It's absolutely extraordinary, who had the same teachings to give them. And in about 80% of the cases, these experiences were indistinguishable from the experiences that are reported by UFO abductees, including being taken up to a spaceship in the sky, having implants put in one's body, having probes put into one's brain, crystal inserted into the brain. All of the experiences that are common for UFO abductees, meeting beings that first appeared as animals or as part animal, part human creatures, all of these experiences, and typically the greys were reported by Rick Strassman's volunteers lying on hospital beds at the University of New Mexico. We know that they were not physically abducted, but their consciousness, I'm suggesting, was abducted. And that does not rule out the physical element to this experience, but it helps us to understand the elusive and curious nature